Picture a desert so lifeless people called it the Sea of Death. 18,000 square kilometers of shifting sand, dunes rising like walls. And the desert didn't sit still. It crept forward year after year, swallowing farms and roads. When the wind rose, the desert became a source of sandstorms that could reach Beijing, roughly 800 kilometers away, darkening the sky over China's capital. Now think about how you'd bring land like that back to life. Water is scarce. The sand keeps moving. Plant a tree in the wrong place, and it can be buried by the next dune or die before its roots ever take hold. Pour in money, and you can still end up with dead saplings and empty sand. For most of human history, the answer was simple. You don't. A desert is forever, except this one isn't anymore. Today, roughly a third of it has been transformed, and it began with a man who wasn't trying to save anything. He was trying to sell salt. Before we get to that man and his salt, you have to understand what he was up against. Everyone who looked at Kubuqi before him reached the same answer. Don't bother. There's a belief almost all of us carry about deserts. Once land turns to sand, it's finished, dead ground, and worse, it doesn't sit still, it spreads. The Kubuqi is China's 7th largest desert, stretching across Inner Mongolia. Less than 3% of it had vegetation, and some dunes rose 100 meters high. And it sat only about 800 kilometers from Beijing. That people had a name for it, a basin of sand hanging over the capital. So how do you bring land like that back? The obvious answer is the one you're already thinking. Just plant trees. Try it though. And the desert answers quickly. There's barely enough rain to keep a tree alive, so many early plantings die. And the ones that survived faced another problem. The sand never stops moving. It creeps forward and buries whatever you plant before the roots can take hold. Fine. Put more people on the problem. Pay them to plant trees. That was tried too. Crews planted across the sand, but most of the trees still died. Not because the workers were lazy, but because once the planting was finished and the money was paid, there was no reason to come back and keep those trees alive. So there it was. Plant more, they die. Spend more, they die. Work harder, they die. Every obvious answer had already failed. The problem wasn't a lack of effort. The problem was that none of those solutions could make the desert sustain itself, which points to one strange fact. The man who finally cracked it didn't start by planting more trees. He started by doing something no one else had thought was worth doing, and what he did sounds almost backwards. He didn't plant a single tree. Not at first. Everyone before him had been fighting the wrong battle, trying to grow life on top of sand that refused to hold still. So his first move wasn't planting, it was pinning the desert down. The method is almost absurdly simple. You lay dry straw across the dunes in a grid, a checkerboard of small squares pressed into the sand. That's it. But inside each square, the wind loses its grip, the sand settles, and for the first time, the ground stops moving long enough for a seedling to take hold. Now you have somewhere to plant. That was move 1. Move 2 was stranger. Instead of paying people simply to plant trees, they paid them for the trees that survived. And suddenly, the incentive changed. If your money depends on a sapling surviving the summer, you don't walk away. You come back for it. But the real breakthrough was the third move, the one almost no one saw coming. They made the desert pay. They turned bare sand into a business crop, medicinal plants, and eventually renewable energy. Because once the land starts creating an income, people have a reason to keep it alive. That was the whole secret. Not a miracle seed, not a machine. 3 quiet moves. Stop the sand, reward what survives, make the green worth money. And none of this began as an environmental mission. The man at the center of the story wasn't trying to save a desert. He was trying to get salt out of it, and we'll come back to him. Because knowing the 3 moves is easy. Pulling them off in a place too dry for almost anything to live is not. So how do you actually bring a dead desert back? It came down to a handful of tricks, most far simpler and stranger than you'd expect. The straw grid pins the sand, but pinned sand is still just sand bone dry and baked. Now you have to grow something in it. So you don't plant just anything. You plant survivors. Willow and saxaul, tough desert plants that live on almost no water. But here's the problem. Planting a seedling by hand in hard, dry ground is painfully slow. Dig the hole, set the root, pack it down for about 10 minutes for one tree. Across millions of trees, that's not practical. So they built something better. A water gun. A worker fires a high-pressure jet of water into the sand, blasting a deep, wet hole. In seconds, then drops the seedling straight in. 10 minutes became 10 seconds. The trees went in faster, and the wet soil gave their roots a better chance to take hold. Then came the clever part. They planted licorice, a hardy desert herb that can help improve the soil while also producing something people can sell. Its roots help add nitrogen to the soil, making it easier for other plants to grow. And because licorice has commercial value, the same plant helping restore the land can also help pay for that restoration. And above it all, they raise solar panels, creating shade that can help protect the soil and crops below while the land generates electricity. Energy on top, farming below, the desert recovering in between. Straw, willows, a water gun, licorice, sunlight, none of it magic on its own. But together, slowly, it was working. And the man who helped put these pieces together, the one who never set out to save a desert only to get his salt out, was about to see his experiment become something much bigger. It's time we came back to him. His name is Wang Wenbiao, and he grew up inside the Sea of Death. As a boy, the sand was in everything. He once said that when he ate, he could taste it. He didn't dream of forests, he dreamed of getting out, and in 1988, he thought he had. He took over a struggling salt works on the edge of the desert. There was just one problem: no road out. To sell his salt, it had to travel the long way around the sand. So he built a road straight across, and the desert swallowed it. To save his business, he had no choice but to fight the sand. He didn't know it yet, but that fight would take the rest of his life. For nearly 25 years, the project lost money. Everyone told him to stop. He didn't. And slowly, square kilometer by square kilometer, the desert began to change. Today, roughly a third of the Kubuqi is no longer bare sand. In the areas they treated, vegetation coverage has risen from less than 3% to more than half. And there's a lake where there used to be dunes. There are farms and vast fields of solar panels feeding the grid. Tourists now come to sandboard on the same dunes that once sent sandstorms toward the cities. And more than 100,000 people who once lived in poverty around the desert have been lifted out of it. The man who spent his childhood desperate to escape the sand spent his life bringing it back to life. And here's what makes the transformation harder to dismiss. You don't have to take China's word for it. NASA satellites have watched the Earth grow greener over the past 2 decades, and researchers found that China accounted for roughly a quarter of the global increase in leaf area, despite covering only a small fraction of the planet's land. So it worked spectacularly, which raises the only question that matters next. Was this one desert a miracle or the beginning of something much bigger? It was the beginning, because China didn't stop at one desert. It took what worked in the Kubuqi and turned it into something almost unimaginable in scale. A project so big it earned a nickname, the Great Green Wall. Since 1978, China has been building a vast belt of forests and grassland across its dry north, the 3 North Shelter Belt, better known as the Great Green Wall. Decades later, the project is still expanding, and slowly, the map began to move the other way. For most of modern history, desertification was spreading across northern China, swallowing farmland and threatening communities. Now, according to China's official data, that trend has reversed. Desertified land is shrinking overall, and sandstorms affecting northern cities have become less frequent. And then, in 2024, came the part that sounds made up. China completed a 3,046-kilometer green belt around the Taklamakan Desert, its largest desert. Not across it, around it, a living barrier of trees and shrubs, designed to hold back the moving sand. Let that sink in. A country looked at one of the most lifeless places on Earth and drew a ring of life around it. So the answer seems obvious. It worked, it scaled. China has become one of the world's biggest contributors to the increase in global vegetation. Except the closer you look at that green, the stranger it starts to seem, because some of those trees drank the land dry, some of them died, and some of that green may not be doing what everyone thinks it's doing at all. Start with the simplest catch: it's partial. For all the talk of a desert turning green, only about a third of the Kubuqi has actually been brought back. The other 2/3 is still sand, and most of the glowing numbers you'll read come from the company that did the work, or from state media that's eager to celebrate. That's why the satellites matter. The independent eyes are the honest check, not the press releases. Then there's the water. This is the big one. Trees are thirsty, and in dry land, every drop has to come from somewhere. Replacing native grasses and shrubs with trees can put far more pressure on the limited water already there. In parts of China, mass tree planting has actually pulled down the underground water tape, meaning the effort to heal the land can quietly leave it drier, and in some cases worse off than before, and some of it simply died. Much of the planting has relied heavily on single species stands, rows of the same poplar or willow, and when an entire landscape depends on one species, a single pest or disease can turn that strength into a weakness. Around the year 2000, a major beetle outbreak killed roughly 1 billion poplars, wiping out years of planting in some area, and the Mu-Us region offered offers another warning. A landscape celebrated for its greening later revealed how vulnerable large-scale tree planting can be when the trees themselves don't survive. And here's the deeper problem. Some scientists argue that parts of this land were never meant to become forests at all. They were natural grasslands. Plant rows of trees there, and you can waste scarce water while replacing habitat that wildlife already depended on. Sometimes the right answer isn't a forest, it's grass. There's even another complication. Not every green pixel satellites see comes from people planting trees. A warmer climate and higher levels of atmospheric CO2 can also increase vegetation growth, making it harder to separate human restoration from nature's own response. None of this erases what happened in Kubuqi. The green is real. The people lifted out of poverty are real. But China conquered the desert is a headline, and the truth underneath it is messier, harder, and a lot more honest. Which leaves one last question. If forcing trees onto the land is so often the wrong answer, then what in the end actually works? Here's what actually worked, and it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect. The desert didn't come back because someone declared war on it. The attempts to force a forest out of the sand often failed. Trees died, water ran short, and the green people tried to impose on the land turned back to brown. What worked was quieter and humbler. You don't fight the sand, you pin it down first and wait. You don't plant what you wish would grow, you plant only what the land can actually keep alive. And above all, you give the people who live there a reason to want the green to survive. Because land that feeds a family gets protected in a way that land that only feeds a headline never will. That's the real lesson. And it's bigger than one desert or one country. Great restoration was never about conquering nature. It's about working with it. Grass where grass belongs, trees where trees belong, and people who have a reason to care. We started with a place people called the Sea of Death, a desert that seemed finished, with sand that would only keep spreading. And today, roughly a third of it has been transformed, not because someone defeated nature, but because people finally learned to work with it. Which leaves one last thought. How many other places have we written off as dead? Not because they truly are, but because no one has yet asked the better question?